text for this morning is Job chapter 9, verses 1 to 35. You'll find Psalms in the middle of your Bible. You can turn back one book and you'll find Job. Then turn to the 9th chapter. That's on 519 in the Geneva Bible. We have a lengthy and a difficult text before us this morning. As you'll remember, Job is being questioned by his three questionable friends, and Eliphaz has already declared Job a hypocrite and guilty and receiving these difficulties as a punishment from God, and Job, of course, answered him. And last week we looked in chapter 8 where Bildad made a very similar argument to Eliphaz's argument. And here in chapter 9, and also 2 weeks from now in chapter 10, Job will answer Bildad's argument. So here we have Job chapter 9, verses 1 to 35. Chapter 9, verse 1. Then Job answered and said, I know verily that it is so, for how should man compared unto God be justified? If he would dispute with him, he could not answer him one thing of 1,000. He is wise in heart and mighty in strength, who hath been fierce against him and hath prospered. He removeth the mountains, and they feel not when he overthroweth them in his wrath. He removeth the earth out of her place, that the pillars thereof do shake. He commandeth the sun, and it riseth not. He closeth up the stars as under a signet. He himself alone spreadeth out the heavens, and walketh upon the height of the sea. He maketh the stars Arcturus, Orion, and Pleiades, and the climates of the south. He doeth great things, and unsearchable, yea, marvelous things without number. Lo, when he goeth by me, I see him not, and when he passeth by, I perceive him not. Behold, when he taketh the prey, who can make him to restore it? Who shall say unto him, What doest thou? God will not withdraw his anger, and the most mighty helpers do stoop under him. How much less shall I answer him, or how should I find out my words with him? For though I were just, yet could I not answer, but I would make supplication to my judge. If I cry and he answer me, yet would I not believe that he heard my voice. For he destroyeth me with a tempest, woundeth me without cause. He will not suffer me to take my breath, but filleth me with bitterness. If we speak of strength, behold, he is strong. If we speak of judgment, who shall bring me into plead? If I should justify myself, mine own mouth shall condemn me. If I would be perfect, he shall judge me wicked. Though I were perfect, yet I know not my soul. Therefore abhor I my life. This is one point, therefore I said, He destroyeth the perfect and the wicked. If the scourge should suddenly slay, should God laugh at the punishment of the innocent? The earth is given into the hand of the wicked. He covereth the faces of the judges thereof. If not, where is he? Or who is he? My days have been more swift than a post. They have fled and have seen no good thing. They are past us with the most swift ships, and as the eagle that flieth to the prey. If I say I will forget my complaint, I will cease from my wrath and comfort me. Then I am afraid of all my sorrows, knowing that thou wilt not judge me innocent. If I be wicked, why labor I thus in vain? If I wash myself with snow water and purge mine hands most clean, yet shalt thou plunge me in the pit, and mine own clothes shall make me filthy. For he is not a man as I am, that I should answer him. If we come together to judgment, neither is there an umpire that might lay his hand upon us both. Let him take his rod away from me, and let not his fear astonish me. Then will I speak and fear him not. But because I am not so, I hold me still. Now, of course, that's only half of his argument. That's enough to look at this morning. These things are said in a very poetic fashion, and poetry is sometimes hard to understand, because sometimes when we speak poetically, we don't always say exactly what we mean. Or sometimes we mean more than we say. So this is a difficult text. We'll start by breaking it up into sections and try to understand each section at a time so that we can understand what's being said. The title of our sermon this morning, Job Answers Bildad, Part 1. Our introduction. In last week's text, we read of the first speech of Bildad, who is Job's second friend. Bildad defended the doctrine of retribution, arguing that God always rewards good and always punishes evil. Bildad moved backwards from result to cause in order to prove that Job's suffering must be the result of his sin. He accused Job, like Eliphaz before him, of challenging the justice and judgment of God. Bildad thinks he helps Job by pleading for him to repent, and makes his argument by showing the fate of the wicked in all its misery, then contrasting that with the fate of the righteous. That's what we looked at last week. If Job should only repent of his sins, says Bildad, and return to God, he would be fully restored. There are 6 points to our message this morning. Verses 1 to 3, God's unsearchable judgment. Verses 4 through 10, the power of God in instituting his will. Verses 11 to 13, the wisdom of God in instituting his will. Verses 14 to 22, Job defends his views of God's judgment. Verses 23 through 31, Job defends against the charge of Bildad. And then verses 32 through 35, Job's hopes dashed, he returns to despair. And now our context for the text this morning. Job's defense against Bildad's charge is found in Job chapters 9 and 10. Job begins his defense by showing that Bildad errs in his interpretation of Job's view of judgment. Job admits that he is a sinner and that God is just. He also admits that God is the decider of all judgments, and rightfully so, for he alone is the judge of behavior and is alone equipped to judge what is moral behavior. Job's argument is that God's judgment appears disproportionate. Just remember that. It's disproportionate, thinks Job. In other words, his crimes or sins against God seem to have been met with a type of wrath that God usually employs for the wickedest of sinners. Therefore, Job says he does not challenge God's judgment or his right to judge. But because he cannot explain it, he's only left to complain. We come to our first point, verses 1 to 3, Job speaking here, God's unsearchable judgment. We can't search and find it. Verses 1 to 3. Then Job answered and said, I know verily that it is so, for how should man compare unto God be justified? If he would dispute with him, he could not answer him one thing of 1,000. Bildad has argued that God is just, and that his judgments are perfect. Therefore, Job should admit his great faults. Bildad, as we saw last week, has a habit of overgeneralizing the problem, and here he is at it again. Job never said that God was not just. He simply argued that the punishment that God's given him has not been consistent, and is the punishment that one would expect for major sins, not for his minor sins. Job agrees wholeheartedly that God is just. He says, quote, I know verily that it is so, which is to say, I know that God is just in all his ways, and that his nature is perfectly righteous. He also knows that God is a fair judge, and does ordinarily bless the righteous and punish the wicked. Job says that he's not such a fool to believe otherwise. However, Job desires to be vindicated, cleared of the suspicion that his punishment is due to sin. Job also knows that he can neither contend with God or dispute with God. God alone defines righteousness. God alone determines the severity of punishment for sin against him. God has no equal. There is no one who can plead that God should change his mind. Whatever God decides is the punishment. For whatever sin is committed is the sole judgment of the Trinity, and it's always just. Man cannot plead what his sin does or does not deserve. Because God decides the rules, when they are applied, and to what severity his judgment is to be applied. Furthermore, his judgments aren't most wise. And even if they could be disputed, there is no real power against God to prevent his will from being perfectly accomplished. Job here in this verse begins to use the terminology of a legal dispute. a theme that we will continue to return to in this text. He allows himself to hope that a mediator could come between him and God and settle their dispute. But he quickly dismisses this possibility, knowing that he could not answer, if he were in a court of law, or be self-justified against the will of God. He goes on in verses 4 to 10. Job shows that he understands the power of God in instituting his will. Verses 4 through 10. He says this, "He is wise in heart and mighty in strength. He hath been fierce against him and hath prospered. He removeth the mountains, and they feel not when he overthroweth them in his wrath. He removeth the earth out of her place, that the pillars thereof do shake. He commandeth the sun, and it riseth not. He closeth up the stars as under a signet. He himself alone spreadeth out the heavens, and walketh upon the height of the sea. He maketh the stars Arcturus, Orion, and Pleiades, and all the climates of the south. He doeth great things and unsearchable, yea, marvelous things without number." In verses 1 to 3, Job toyed with the idea of bringing God to litigation, or having some mediator to hear his cause. This description of God's power here in verses 4 to 10 shows the impossibility of bringing a being as powerful as God to litigation. Litigation is where you'd have two people and they would try to settle a dispute and there'd be a mediator, that kind of thing. Here Job gives known examples of God's divine power. Job emphasizes from personal experience the suddenness of God's power. Job first depicts the power of God in destruction, here in verses 5 through 7, and then the power of God in creation, in verses 8 to 10. Here in verses 5 to 7, Job notes that God has suddenly removed mountains by earthquakes and cities by shaking their pillars or foundations. He also notes God gives laws to the sun concerning its rising and its setting, and when it should give its light. And he determines when the stars should give their light, or when the stars should be darkened or closed. He's a God of destruction, powerful, unlimited destruction. The sun is larger than any man, and yet when he commands it, it does rise. He may send an eclipse, clouds, sandstorms, or even unnatural darkness, like he did in Egypt. When he pleases, he has complete control over the universe. Verses 8 to 10 show God's creative power, and therefore his providence. God created and controls the vast curtain of the sky, here called the heavens, and he alone has superiority over the heavens. God also created the three most magnificent constellations, Arcturus, Orion, and Pleiades, in the northern hemisphere, as well as the stars of the southern hemisphere. That's what it means by the climates of the south, the stars of the southern hemisphere. Job acknowledges that God has the power in verse 10, but he is not concerned so much with God's power, but as with the manner in which God has used his power in bringing Job low for what seems like to Job very little reason. We come to our third point, verses 11 through 13. First we looked at the wisdom or the power of God in instituting his will. Now the wisdom of God in instituting his will. Verses 11 through 13. "Lo, when he goeth by me, I see him not. And when he passeth by, I perceive him not. Behold, when he taketh the prey, who can make him to restore it? Who shall say unto him, What doest thou? God will not withdraw his anger, and the most mighty helpers do stoop under him." Job states that while he sees the effects of God's powerful creative actions, he cannot understand the causes or grounds of these actions. Job argues that God's purposes are beyond man. We are too weak and too sinful to understand his counsels or his ways. We may see the works of God, but we may not fully understand the wisdom behind these powerful works of God. If God determines to take away from any man all of his children or his servants or his property, as he has done to Job, Who is able to restrain God from doing it? Job asks. Or who would dare to question God's judgment? And so Job says that he is not questioning God's justice. God can do as he pleases, and whatever he pleases is holy. If God chooses to do something a certain way that is foreign to our understanding, who is able or has the right to hinder or speak against him? Who can reason with God and attempt to point out his errors of justice? And so Job makes his complaint that he at first cannot apprehend or understand the ways of God. That's what he said in verse 11. Nor can he hold God back from taking action. Verse 12a. Or can he reproach or question God for his actions in judgment? Verse 12b. Or can he withstand his anger? Verse 13. For everyone, he says, even the most mighty helpers, are subject to his will and do stoop under him. We come to our fourth point. Now, Job, having defended the power of God and the idea that he understands God's justice, he starts to address Bildad's faulty view of his accusations against justice. Verses 14 to 22, Job defends his views of God's judgment. Verses 14 and 15. How much less shall I answer him? Or how shall I find out my words with him? For though I were just, yet could I not answer, but I would make supplication to my judge. Since Bildad believed that Job overreached when he spoke of the judgment of God, Job here tries to show Bildad that he misunderstood his words. Job gives 5 arguments in these verses to support his view of God's righteous judgment. Job was not calling into question God's judgment, but defending against the charge that he was a hypocrite. Bildad erred because he concluded that God cannot use extraordinary temporal judgment against only the wicked. In Job's first argument here in verse 14, he agrees that no man can know the ways of God, nor can man resist the will of God or dispute God's judgments. Job asks, do you, Bildad, think that I would ever attempt to overcome God by reason? Or make God's subject to my judgment? Even if Job could take God to litigation, Job as the defendant could not withstand God's verbal onslaughts during cross-examination. Secondly, Job argues in verse 15 that even if he thought himself completely righteous, he would not pretend to know the will of God because God knows Job better than he knows himself. And therefore we're all at his mercy, whatever he decides. Verses 16 to 18. If I cry and he answers me, yet would I not believe that he heard my voice. For he destroyeth me with a tempest and woundeth me without cause. He will not suffer me to take my breath, but filleth me with bitterness. This is one of those examples of poetry where we have to be careful. It sounds like Job is stating something very wrong. But poetry allows for this pouring out of emotion to such a depth that he's not necessarily saying something wrong, but saying something in an extreme way. It's allowed when we come to poetry. Here Job still imagines a court in which God would be forced to give him reasons for his actions. In this scenario, Job is the interrogator, but he admits he could not speak in the presence of God's divine anger. Here in Job's argument, verses 16 to 18, he states that he feels himself well below God. So much so that he said that if God heard his voice or prayer and answered, and so relieved him of his distress, he would be surprised that the Almighty God would take any concern at all for his burdens. He continues saying that he is so below God and so filled and ravished with sin that he is a perpetual offense to God and undeserving of any answer. But why, we might ask, why should Job be so contrary to God answering his prayers? Well, because in the past God seemed to answer him and to be pleased with him, but out of nowhere God began treating Job like his worst enemy in the mind of Job. Because Job says, for he destroyeth me with a tempest and woundeth me without cause. God unexpectedly and violently appeared to turn on Job without warning. And so for Job, without cause or extraordinary sin, he was broken. Since that day when he thought all was well with God, he has been in continual misery in both body and soul. Job therefore complains, if I tried to fight him, he is stronger. If I plead my innocence, he is more righteous, and therefore I must receive his judgment without question. Verses 19 to 22. If we speak of strength, behold, he is strong. If we speak of judgment, who shall bring me in to plead? If I should justify myself, mine own mouth shall condemn me. If I would be perfect, he shall judge me wicked. Though I were perfect, yet I know not my soul. Therefore abhor I my life. This is one point, therefore I said, he destroyeth the perfect and the wicked. Here in his fourth argument, beginning in verse 19, he states that if I tried to plead with God, he would easily find fault with my choice of words. We would find fault with my thought processes, with my reasoning, and with my cause. Job says, I will be forced to side with God against myself and join him in condemning myself. If I claim mine innocence of any fault, he would immediately show to me the depths of my sin, that even I have not explored, and show me my own hidden faults that he's not even aware of. Then Job continues in his fifth argument, verses 20 and 21, saying that even if he tried to justify himself, his own confession of being a sinner would condemn himself. Or if he thought himself perfect, he is incapable of being a judge over his own perfections, because he's imperfect. Only God defines and understands perfection. Therefore, Job says that he could not trust the integrity of his own soul or mind, and for that reason he says, therefore I abhor my life. Job closes his 5 arguments of this section in verse 22 by stating that he used to think he understood the judgments of God. For up to this point, Job probably would have believed in the doctrine of retribution, which is that good is always rewarded and bad is always punished. But this latest instance has called the whole doctrine into question. Now Job says concerning God, he destroyeth the perfect and the wicked. Job speaks here from contrasting points of view. On the one hand, he has been declared blameless, and on the other hand, he feels himself under the wrath of God and he abhors his life. Job believes that no blameless person should ever have to feel so hopeless. It is the wicked that should hold their life cheap, not the righteous. For it is they who are likely to be cut off at any moment. Since both wicked and righteous are made to suffer, Job notes very little difference between the two. And now here in verse 23 through 31, he really makes his great argument. Job defends against the charge of Bildad. I think you'll enjoy this. This is absolutely brilliant. Verses 23 through 31, 23 and 24. If the scourge should suddenly slay, should God laugh at the punishment of the innocent? The earth is given into the hand of the wicked. He covereth the faces of the judges thereof. If not, where is he, or who is he? Now, you know up to this point, Job's just been taking it. Now he finally gives it back, and he gives it back good. And Bildad has no defense against this. Now Job directly attacks Bildad's conclusion that God has plagued him with temporal judgments because he was a hypocrite and a wicked man. Job argues here in verse 23 that to the mind of man, the ways of God towards the wicked and the righteous sometimes appear the same. We would all agree with that. For at times God may appear to punish the wicked and the righteous alike. And while it looks the same to man, God brings harm to the wicked for punishment's sake, but tries the righteous towards perfection. Job then states that if God should unexpectedly burden a righteous man, from the perspective of man, Bildad and Eliphaz, it might appear that God punishes both the same. However, while God may appear to laugh, as the text says, or look indifferently towards the wicked and the innocent alike, God does not delight in punishing the righteous, but he does delight in the trial of their faith because of the good he is making out of it. Therefore, Job argues, dominion of the earth is given into the hand of the wicked, but only for a time, and they are soon destroyed. Verse 24. Here's what he says. For the righteous judges he covereth the faces. In other words, God allows those who practice righteousness to be cast down. And so God allows the wicked to take the places of the righteous. So Job asks, if it is not so that the just men are often chastised and cast down, and the wicked men are often lifted up and in prosperity, tell me where or who is he that has the large portion of the world, asks Job. Is it the righteous man who rules the world or the wicked man who rules the world? It is clearly the wicked, and it always has been. Job is, therefore, if God always punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous, Job asks, why do the wicked rule the world? Unanswerable question. Job is not saying that God gives the world over to the wicked, but illustrating the fact that the righteous must not always prosper if the wicked are ruling the world. It's a great argument. Verses 25 through 31. My days have been more swift than a post. They have fled and have seen no good thing. They are past us with the most swift ships, and as the eagle that flieth to the prey. If I say I will forget my complaint, I will cease from my wrath and comfort me. Then I am afraid of all my sorrows, knowing that thou wilt not judge me innocent. If I be wicked, why labor I thus in vain? If I wash myself with snow water and purge mine hands most clean, yet shalt thou plunge me in the pit, and mine own clothes shall make me filthy. Now Job completes his defense, and in doing so not only addresses Bildad, but also speaks to God. And you can see that because the person changes from the third person to the second person. Job begins by describing his life, saying that it has seen no good thing. Most people expect a life of ups and downs and a variety of experiences. But Job says he's had only one experience, no good. He uses three examples of speed to show how his days have flown by. He gives an example from land, a swift carrier, a person who carries a message to the king, here called a post. He gives an example from sea, the most swift ships. And he gives an example from the air, an eagle that attacks its prey. Job here desires some relief from his misery. He asks if there is any way to escape being under the perpetual chastisement of God. He says that if he tries to stop complaining and look upon things positively, he is brought low quickly by his physical and mental torments so that he cannot forget his suffering even for a moment. Therefore, Job concludes, if I be wicked, why labor I thus in vain? Job said, since there is no reason to defend himself against the judgments of God, whether he is holy or innocent, there is always some sin and guilt within Job that God could bring out and severely punish. He asks, why labor I thus in vain? Or why trouble myself with clearing mine innocence, when God will always find a reason to hold me guilty? Even Job says, even if he could wash away his sins with snow water, mentioned for its purity, or purge his life, which represents his hands, of all wicked deeds, he could never prove himself without sin, as we see in verse 30, and judicially God would prove him guilty and always filthy, verse 31. Job needs a redeemer, but he knows that he cannot redeem himself. When we come to the conclusion of this matter, verses 32 through 35, our sixth point, Job's hopes dashed, he returns to despair. You'll notice for a minute he starts